You're listening to Nutrition Matters podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Nutrition Matters podcast explores how to approach food and your body in a whole new way. I interview people who share stories and expertise in rejecting diet culture, making peace with food, and discovering a more positive, realistic, and sustainable approach to health and well-being. I'm Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist, and owner of Positive Nutrition, an in-person nutrition therapy practice in Salt Lake City, Utah. I offer free resources, including this podcast, a blog, and posts on social media. If you're local to Salt Lake City, check out our services and availability for appointments, and keep your eyes out for in-person groups on mindfulness, intuitive eating, body image resilience, and more. Go to positive-nutrition.com and hit subscribe if you'd like to keep in touch. I also offer online courses covering topics like the science of nutrition, mindfulness, and healing your relationship with food. Check those out at positive-nutrition.com/academy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, you can make a difference by leaving a review, sharing with friends and family, or making a donation. Thank you so much for your support. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought at Paige Smathers RD. Thank you so much for listening. Hi everyone, it's Paige. Welcome back to another episode of Nutrition Matters podcast. I'm so glad you're here. I'm really excited to bring you this episode with Evelyn, Tribole, and Elyse Resch, co-authors of Intuitive Eating. It is such a rich discussion about common misconceptions with intuitive eating, with common questions we get, with some of the changes that they made in the newest edition of the book, which was recently released. Lots of really great content from Evelyn and Elyse, who are so wise and so experienced and just so thoughtful in the way that they responded to my questions. I just loved it. So I'm really excited to share this with you. Thanks so much for being here. And as always, if you feel like this content is helpful, there's a couple of options for you to go deeper. First, you can always just share this content with friends and family. That's very helpful to me and the podcast to keep it going. You can also opt in at a $5 per month level, and you can get 3 extra podcast episodes per month, which is a lot of fun. I do a Q&A podcast in there. I do a nutrition lesson, and then I also do a guided meditation, which we'll talk about in this podcast episode, but a lot of what I'm aiming to do there is to help you build interceptive awareness, which is a key process behind the concept of intuitive eating. So that is available. You can just click in the show notes, and there's always a link in there to become a supporter of the podcast. And then beyond that, if you'd like a little bit more guidance in the form of an online course, there's the Positive Nutrition Academy, which is just positive-nutrition.com/academy. And there's a bunch of webinars that are shorter, and then online courses, which are longer. They're all self-paced and available, ready to go. The one that I really think will have a lot to do with the content here is the Positive Nutrition for Life online course. So that is a really in-depth course. I actually take you through the intuitive eating book, take you through the principles, and we do a lot of work before that, and we do a lot of work after that in the online course. So that's just one section of the online course, is taking you through the book. And that's a really in-depth, kind of will take you a couple months to work through. But I'm really proud of what I've done there, and it's a really fabulous online course. So check that out. If this stuff that we talk about in this podcast feels interesting, or if it's like, ooh, I love that, I want to go deeper, consider joining that online course as a resource. Okay, I think that's it. Evelyn and Elyse introduced themselves a little bit in the podcast, but the main thing you need to know is they are co-authors of Intuitive Eating. They originally published the book back in 1995, so it's 25 years old at the time of this recording, and they recently released the 4th edition, which I have a copy of myself, and I can say wholeheartedly it's worth, even if you already have a copy, it's worth actually getting this new one. It's just new and improved. It is I love the beginning where they go through all the studies about intuitive eating and kind of talk about the take-home messages from that. And there's improvements in language and order and sequencing and all kinds of things that I just think they did a really great job on. So there's also a link in the show notes to buy their book if you're interested in that. And thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy this podcast episode. Hi, Evelyn and Elyse. Welcome to Nutrition Matters podcast, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Paige.
Thrilled to be
thank
here.
you for having us. Yes.
Yay! All right, for those of you who maybe have been not listening to this podcast or living under the proverbial rock, my two guests today are Evelyn Tribole and Elyse Resch, co-authors of the phenomenal book Intuitive Eating. And welcome to both of you, and thank you again for taking the time to join me. So really quick, Elyse, do you want to just take a second to introduce yourself and talk about who you are and what you do briefly, and then we'll dive in? And Evelyn, you take a turn too.
Sure, of course. Yes. I am a nutrition therapist, registered dietitian, nutritionist, and I'm a certified eating disorder RD and supervisor. And I've been in private practice for 38 years. My second career, I was an elementary school teacher before I went back to graduate school. So I use a lot of that. Most of my clients have that kid in them, so I'm using a lot of that in my work. And I think for the last 5 years, I've been writing nonstop. There've been a number of books, so that's a big piece of it too. And then adjusting to doing all of the counseling virtually has been really interesting the last 4 months. That's me.
Yeah, great. And it's been a pretty wild 4 months, that's for sure. How about you, Evelyn?
Yeah, I have similar credentials in terms of RDN and, specializing in eating disorders, and have the credential of SED supervisor. But I also do a lot of speaking and training, and I love this. And one of the things Elyse and I are so proud of is we now have over 1,000 health professionals trained and certified in our work in over 24 countries. So to see this really grow globally, it gives me a lot of hope. And I don't ever get tired of talking about this. I have such passion, I think, because when you can witness the change in the lives of your clients and patients, it's a phenomenal gift and privilege to witness and facilitate that, and it keeps the passion going even when the times get really tough.
Yeah. Well,
I would say our goal is to I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
You're fine.
Our goal is to get the word out in so many ways, including, as Evelyn said, supervising and training, because we're just two voices, and a lot of people read the book, but the more people that we can, inform and get the word out themselves, and our legacy keeps going with all of the people that we're supervising. It's just a wonderful feeling to know that more people are going to be reached.
Well, I have to tell you this, just yesterday I had a client who I've been working with for quite a while, and things have just not been clicking. And just yesterday, this client told me, I had a breakthrough, and I was like, what was it? And they put up your book into the camera, because obviously we're doing telehealth. And
wow.
he actually read to me some of the passages that just really clicked and really made sense, and he was almost in tears. It was just it was this moment of like, oh, I'm so glad there's books like this for people, because it's a lot of what we've been talking about, but sometimes we need to hear it and read it and listen to it in podcasts and, see it on social media or various ways of learning. And so I love having this as a resource, and just so grateful to both of you for all your hard work for literally decades.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Because Elyse and I were talking, because this is, as you know, Paige, our 4th edition. So it's been 25 years since the first book was published. And I got to tell you, with this particular edition, I think Elyse would agree, and you can say if you disagree, but this is the hardest we've ever worked because there was so much in terms of how we have evolved. We wanted to update the book with all the new research and then taking a closer look at, diet culture and weight stigma and baby-led weaning, which is like intuitive eating for babies. And while we were doing these updates, it's like, oh, let's take a look at the whole book and let's just see if we need to, clean some stuff up. And I was mortified. And Elyse and I decided to be really transparent about this in terms of our evolution. In part, I think it's an important thing to do, but it gives other people, hopefully, permission to realize that we can grow and evolve. And as we know better, we do better. And I think for a lot of people who get trained in weight-centric models, which are most people in healthcare, that when you come across this information and all this body of research that say, hey, the pursuit of intentional weight loss actually causes harm, and P.S. it doesn't work, it throws you into this place of cognitive dissonance, and I think in part because you're holding two things like, wow, this is not what I was taught, and yet what I'm reading here makes so much sense, and there's this reckoning and this wrestling that needs to happen. And so it was really surprising to go back and see how much we have evolved, and also it's incredibly humbling, but I think we need to be humble. I think we need to have cultural humility, intellectual humility, lived experience humility, and it's been a profound process. What would you say, Elyse?
Yes, I mean, we've had to give ourselves a lot of grace, and we have to model not being judgmental. We had to look at our process over the years and know that we did the best we could when we did. And as Evelyn said, as we evolve, as we start thinking in a very different way, we have been able to show that in the book. And we probably still, made some mistakes, and we did the best we could do. But it's about giving ourselves grace and humility and all of that. So
I love that.
We hope that others will feel that way. Yeah.
This is a topic I actually hit on quite a bit too myself. The way that I can relate to what you're saying is having a podcast for 5 years and sitting down with wise, brilliant, just such amazing people through the years. I can't help but evolve and change and learn and adapt. And so I've kind of wrestled with some of the beginning of my podcast. I don't feel this exact same way now as I did then, and I wouldn't say it quite that way. And I've kind of wrestled with that similar concept of just trying to just be open and model that kind of willingness and permission to, it's okay to change your mind, it's okay to adapt, it's okay to evolve. And I think to a certain extent there's value just in being open to that and showing that. So I love what you're saying. I think that that's really powerful. I would love to hear, what are some specific elements of kind of evidence of your evolution through the years? Any kind of little tidbits that you can say, oh yeah, we saw this in our last edition and thought, oh geez, that's not how we'd say it, or what are some specifics?
Well, I would start by saying that in our first edition, we had find your, I think, natural weight, or find whatever, something like that.
That was the second edition. Yeah.
That was the second edition also?
Mm-hmm. No, it wasn't on the first. It was on the second.
On the second one. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
On the cover of the book. And we didn't really quite get the negative impact of that until, some people would say things. And that's why we thought that we needed to make a lot of big changes in the third edition, and we thought we did. And yet there was still some of that. Not that we said find your natural weight, but we here and there were comments that had some focus on weight that we didn't even realize. So we pulled all that out for this one. So I think that that would be one of the biggies, was changing that and then bringing it to talking about weight bias and weight stigma, and helping people shift their thinking in that way. So I would say that's one big one. Evelyn, do you have another one?
Yeah, and we also made a really big effort at being a gender neutral, with with our pronouns.
Yes.
There was a lot. So, like in the third edition, that's where we added the health at every size, that we're in alignment with health at every size, and we thought that was pretty good. But then as we kept seeing all the research now, that's the other thing that's changed. There really is a new body of research on weight stigma and the stuff that's coming out in diet culture, which has caused us to look even deeper. And even now as we speak, with all that's going on with Black Lives Matter and social justice, and then with Sabrina String's book, The Racial Roots of Fat. It's called Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Roots of Fat Phobia. It's a profound book. We mention it in our fourth edition, but we didn't unpack it. And, even as I'm looking at all of this, it's like, we need to have the most marginalized bodies in our culture feel safe in order to have liberation of bodies, and so I just see how this work will continue to evolve. But I'm pleased with what we did, but I have a feeling there's more to be done. Actually, it's not a feeling, it's a fact. There's more to be done. Yeah.
The more you learn, the more you realize how much there is to learn and how many more questions you have, right?
Yeah.
Well,
And then
oh, sorry, Evelyn.
Yeah.
I'll just say one quick thing. I mean, I think it would be pretty terrible if we felt we had learned it all and we were completely evolved, at some point. I mean, we're always going to be growing, no matter what age we are at or how much experience we have. So I think it's a good thing.
I do too. And I love this idea that, we're lifelong learners. But one of the things I think that's strong in the book, when we first wrote the first edition of Intuitive Eating, we can say it was research inspired. It was based on our clinical experience, was based on the research we found and some other things. But fast forward 25 years later, there's now over 125 studies on our work really showing promise, including there's, the intuitive eating assessment that could be done thanks to Tracy Tilka. And so that's something that was actually really a lot stronger in this edition because we talk about those studies. And we also talk about one of the mechanisms behind intuitive eating, perceptive awareness. And while that's a mouthful, I'll tell you it's so profound because what this is, it's the ability to perceive physical sensations that arise within our body. And that might sound like, okay, that includes, hunger and fullness. It includes states like having a full bladder. But the fact this also connects to our emotion. Every emotion has a physical sensation. And so when we are connected with our bodies, we have a powerful treasure trove of information to get our needs met, both psychologically and biologically. But conversely, when we're at war in our bodies or we don't feel safe in our bodies, it's hard to hear the message, let alone respond in a timely manner. So I think this is all really exciting stuff.
That was one of the things I wanted to tell you that I just loved as kind of a nerdy, curious person. Just the one of the first sections in the new edition is outlining all of those studies and all of the research, and I just thought that was such a wonderful addition to the new book. So well done there.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we really thought about it deeply and realized that by putting all of the research up front, gave people much more validity and belief in the process. They could read about that and say, oh, this actually does have a strong, impact and makes a difference in people's lives. And then I think they're more open to go on to learn the principles. So that was a big change, by the way. It was moving that to the first chapter or the beginning of the book. Yes.
Yeah, I think that was a great change. I loved that. And Evelyn, you just brought up such a great point, something I do want to kind of zoom in on, if that's okay.
Yeah.
This concept of interceptive awareness, and I loved how you put it, where when we learn to, and I'm paraphrasing, maybe using my own words here, but when we learn to tune into the cues that our body gives us, and maybe we focus on hunger and fullness for while we're kind of on this intuitive eating, when this is an important part of our process at the time. But what I find really fascinating, and one of my favorite parts of my job as a dietitian, is to help. I love that when we learn these skills with our body, they can't help but translate into other areas of life, like I actually think of running my practice and my business as fundamentally like rejecting the diet mentality and being like connected and in tune with what feels right to me. And that might sound kind of woo and out there, but there's diet mentality in business too, right? Like follow this formula and you'll get this result. I promise you, as long as you work hard enough, it will look this way. And I detect it everywhere, not just with food. And I think these skills that we learn as we work on intuitive eating are just so powerful because they translate into other areas in parenting, business, relationships. Uh, what are your thoughts on that?
Well,
Ooh,
I think it's in addition to what you were just saying. I mean, well, not even in addition. I think the foundation of what you're saying, Paige, is that it's really about being intuitive. It's about listening to your gut. I mean, listening to the wisdom that you have within you and being able to apply that. I think that's what you're saying to all different areas. It's like intuitive living. It's
Yes.
not doubting yourself. You can question yourself when there's I wonder if that's right or not, but really taking time to dig deeply into what your intuitive wisdom is, and I think we all have it. I think it's a matter of whether we allow ourselves to tune in. So
yeah, it's uncovering it. And, one of the scientists who was really instrumental in bringing interceptive awareness in the research front, A.D. Craig, had this beautiful statement in this very highly technical book on interceptive awareness. And he talks about how all this processing happens in the brain and it's happening right now. And because you can only experience physical sensations right now. You can't experience a sensation in the past or in the future. And he goes on to call it the global emotional moment, which then connects us to our human sentient beingness. And I just love that language. I think it's beautiful. And I think it relates, to what you're describing, Paige. And that is this transformation that spills over into other parts of your life because you're connecting with yourself, you're connecting with your wisdom, and you're healing the disruption of trust that took place because of diet culture, which is everywhere. It's insidious. And it's really sad right now because it's in healthcare. And that's a part we really had to also explain in the book. In the good old days, that sounds weird. It was just the weight loss industry, the fitness industry, and the beauty industry putting in all this pressure along with the media. But now, fast forward, we have healthcare policy that has weight centricism all over it. And so now patients and clients are coming in with pressure from their doctors, even though there isn't good research to back it up. And it's incredibly frustrating because it's so harmful to a patient's well-being. And it feeds into the myth that health is about body size, and it is absolutely not about body size. There's so much more to that.
And it goes back centuries, actually. I mean, it may be prominent now in terms of the concept of health, but as I've been reading, I mean, there were doctors 200 years ago talking about size and health and, putting them together. So it's been around and it's prominent now.
So yes, and I would love to hear what, like, just as people, as humans, what's it been like to have a book published 25 years ago? And I don't know if my assessment of how, like, the lens I see all of this through, I recognize I might have it off. So tell me if I am off, but it really feels like this has just skyrocketed and it is in the just common lexicon. I don't even know if that's the right word, but I'll throw it out there just in case, of like regular people are talking about intuitive eating, and it's all over social media, and it's as a result of that people are misunderstanding it and in some ways sort of bastardizing the concept of it. And I'm so interested to hear what's that like for your baby to be out there and for it to be so misunderstood and so kind of washed down. I don't know. Do you feel that way?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's very complicated because on the one hand, we're so excited that it's, gone so to speak viral, and that so many people are now opening up to it. And on the other hand, so many people are abusing it. And the way I spoke to some young woman about a month or so ago who had never even read the book, but had decided she's going to counsel people on intuitive eating. And I said, I questioned, I don't think I've told you about this, Evelyn. And I questioned her. I actually called her and spoke to her for a half an hour, especially because I went on her website and saw the way she put pictures of herself on there. And I said, this is not okay. And she said, yeah, but it's intuitive eating. It's out there. Everybody knows about intuitive eating. I mean, everybody uses that term. It's nothing particular. And that's when I said, have you even read the book? And she said, well, no. I mean, we just know about it. So it's troublesome. It can be troublesome and it can be exciting at the same time. So
yeah,
well, and that's part of the reason we started certifying people. But the other thing is what's happening, I think, because of the popularity, it is being co-opted, and so it's funny. One of my most popular Instagram posts is how to spot fake intuitive eating. And, diet culture is very, very sneaky. And when they start changing the language, we're not a diet, we're a lifestyle. We're not a diet, we're wellness. We're not a diet, we're psychological. Or they use terms of intuitive eating, they use terms of mindfulness, and it really confuses people, and even more so, it causes harm. And so one of the things we like to say, if any program that says they're using intuitive eating, but they're recommending weight loss, or you're counting things, or you're measuring things, that is problematic, because the moment you focus on shifting the size of your body, it actually interferes with this kind of connection. And by the way, for the record, Elyse and I, we're not against if someone loses weight, but the whole point about intuitive eating is healing your relationship, or cultivating your relationship with food, mind, and body. And we can't tell you what's going to happen to your body as you go on this process, but if you set up this promise and this expectation of weight loss, you do harm. And it creates the expectation that if someone doesn't lose weight, then they're doing it wrong. And we have to recognize that there's diversity in body size, and that's part of the issue.
And I want to add to that what Evelyn just said, in that we have such compassion for people when they come in and say they want to lose weight. They have been programmed by diet culture.
That's understandable.
Of course, they're feeling that way. Evelyn, I don't think I told you this, but I just realized in the spelling of diet culture, there is cult. C-U-L-T. And I actually realized that there's so much brainwashing, there's so much out there that people don't even question it. They just assume that their lives are going to be better, and that's the goal, is to lose weight. So as Evelyn said, it's not that we're against it, and this compassion piece is such a big part of our work, self-compassion and compassion for others. And so of course you feel that way to a client. Of course, this is what you've been taught probably since you were very young, and in the family and the doctors, all over the media. And so we help people not feel bad about themselves for wanting that, but help them understand how it does interfere. You can't be in tune with your internal signals when that is the focus. So I just wanted to throw the compassion piece in.
I think that's an important part to acknowledge, Elyse. And then, another nuance is, for a lot of people, getting on the diet culture bandwagon can be a coping mechanism, especially right now in the time of COVID, when we're seeing so much uncertainty in so many domains of our lives. It's really understandable that you want the promise of certainty, you want the idea of fantasy, and clear, specific of directions of do this and don't do that. And when you look at it through the lens of a coping mechanism, it's like, that's why that's so appealing. But the real problem is it's not sustainable and causes harm and promotes weight stigma. And, diet culture is so loud, and people don't talk about the fallout. They don't talk about the loss of control eating and the weight stigma that gets perpetuated, and the constant worry on the mind, and how it ends up interfering with relationships and so on. And so sometimes when I'm talking about some of these things with my patients, they're hearing it for the first time. They had no idea. They thought there was something broken about them. It's like, no. Dieting and diet culture is the problem, and they're just gaslighting you to make, it makes you feel like there's something wrong with you, and there's not,
Yes. I have a new client. I've had 2 sessions with her, and she is an actress, and so a lot of pressure, about weight in that culture. And she said to me yesterday, she had gone away and we hadn't talked for a month. She said, "This is miraculous." She said, "For the first time in my life, I am enjoying food, and my body is just my body, and I'm okay, and it's going to be okay." And it was just such a wonderful thing to hear the freedom that she was feeling and the joy she was feeling. And she has 2 teenage daughters, or college-age daughters. And she said, they have said things to her about, "Mom, you're just so different, the way you're talking." and it's really impacted them as well. So that was pretty wonderful.
And sometimes people, I mean, you both have brought up such great points. Sometimes it can feel lonely to be challenging the kind of common narrative around dieting and weight loss. And it can feel lonely if nobody in your circles is aware of this other way of approaching food. And if it feels like, especially, I have to acknowledge if you're someone in a larger body who is not dieting and who is working to connect to your body and simultaneously dealing with all the people in your life asking you what diet you're on and trying to navigate how you handle those social situations and how you explain yourself or whether or not to explain yourself. I often like to tell people, like, you never know if you're this trailblazer who's like the beginning of the ripple effect in your circle, right? Where it can feel lonely, but maybe in 5 years you'll look back and be like, but look, like now I have like a couple other people in my world who have learned about this because, I was brave and talked about it, or I was willing to sit down and just kind of vulnerably share my experience with people as I felt comfortable. I don't think we're going to feel all of us are going to feel lonely forever. And I just try to kind of offer that hope because I know that that's a really challenging part of this is you can't unsee it once you've seen it.
Well, you're so right. And it's one of the reasons why we created the support. It's a free support group online, the Intuitive Eating Community, which is a free peer-to-peer support group. We have about 20,000 people in there. And I think it's so important to have community, so you have a place where you've got some connection and understanding. And for some people, they really go through a process of grieving. Sometimes they discover that some of the relationships and friendships they have been based around dieting and diet culture, or sometimes they're grieving the loss of a body they thought that they were going to have, and all the time and the energy that they spent, and the cost of that in terms of cost to their relationships and the time and money spent, and so on. It's truly a process.
Yeah, definitely. Elyse, did you want to comment on that?
Well, I think that community is so important, obviously. And I think that sometimes people just need to feel okay within themselves, because when they start talking to people who aren't in a community that supports this, it's really hard for them. And so some of my clients have just learned to set a boundary and not talk to the people that, feed them negative reactions to it. And then little by little, with the reading, with our community, with everything in the media that's talking about intuitive eating, as you mentioned earlier, Paige, that it's all out there. They're starting to feel that there are safe places for them. But sometimes they're just, with their families. One of my clients yesterday was talking about how she just has to set a boundary with her mother, because every time she gets on the phone with her, that's not even one client, that's many clients. She's getting questions about, well, how are you doing with your food? Are you still talking to that person? If she's told them about intuitive eating, are you still talking to that person? And so I think that it's a balance between speaking up where it's safe and kind of taking care of yourself when you know that you can't get the kind of response if you do speak up. I will tell you a little story. I was at a dinner a while ago. There were 6 of us there, and 4 people just kept talking about how they need to lose 20 pounds. They shouldn't have eaten this or that. And these were women of a certain age, closer to my age, and each one of them amazing and successful in different ways. It was an artist and a therapist and a dentist, and I mean, people who had really successful careers, and yet their narrative was all about how they weighed too much. They had to lose weight. So I stood up, which was in my earlier life would not have been easy for me to do. And I just really literally stood up and I said, please, why are you spending so much time feeling terrible about yourselves? Each of you is this wonderful, amazing human being. And, let's take a look at that, how you've been programmed to put aside your value as a person and put it on whether you're losing or gaining weight. So I can speak up now and say these things, not that they necessarily listen to me, but I'm not too afraid to do that anymore. But for some people, it's hard to speak up.
Elyse, that's such a great point. I love what you're saying, that balance between, you don't always need to speak up, and you like, it's okay to just set a boundary or to just walk away or to just not engage. I think that's actually a lot of times I have to have that conversation with people. How do you handle your mom or your social connections when they're questioning how you're approaching food? So I loved that so much. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. You're not bad at intuitive eating if you're not engaging in, arguing about it every second. Like, and I love what you said, Elyse, that you said just kind of offhand, like, oh, I don't even know if they were listening to me, which I just want to highlight because listen, if the author of Intuitive Eating isn't sure if people are listening to her, like, maybe the average person who's new to learning this stuff, maybe it's a lot to ask of yourself, to be so familiar with the research and how to exactly explain this, and how to kind of navigate that really vulnerable place you might be in, where you kind of want to almost convert people to your side so that you feel a little bit more validated. Like, I just think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. It's hard for all of us, regardless of credential or training or education, to explain this when someone is really, really knee deep in diet culture. So that's a really important point, I think.
Well, and I think
also. Go ahead, Evelyn. That's okay.
Oh,
go ahead.
Yeah. Well, there also needs to be a place of readiness, and most adults don't like being told what to do. And so there's this delicate dance and there's this gap. And I like the idea that we're planting seeds, that we don't have to recruit or convince anybody. They do need to be ready. And sometimes maybe we're the planter of the seed, and maybe we're the watering of that seed, and maybe that watering needs to happen 10 or 20 times. And I think that might give some perspective, because one of the things I think about, especially when I'm training other health professionals in this work, is I want you in it for the long haul, and I don't want you to burn out. And you could get really burnt out if you're shouting to the mountaintop to everybody, and you need to protect your energy. And there's a mantra I love by one of my mentors, Desiree Attaway. And her saying is, are they reachable, are they teachable, and are they ready? And if the answer is yes, then you consider spending energy. And that's what I do. My little spin on that take is, and what is my bandwidth? Do I have the energy to engage? Because we also have the right to decide that. And I say it to my patients also. You might not have the bandwidth that day, and I want you in it for the long haul. And what are some ways you can support yourself? What do you need in order to feel safe? We don't have to go about this in a way of perfectionism. And that's one of the, I see that the fallouts of diet culture, a lot of perfectionism, a lot of binary, all or none kind of thinking. And sometimes people, through the lens of diet culture, unwittingly apply it to intuitive eating. And it's like, no, intuitive eating is not pass or go. It's not a bunch of rules. They're guidelines. It's about your freedom. It's a journey of learning and discovery. And everyone has a different path and a different pace at which they're going to go with that, depending on their experiences and willingness and readiness.
And I want to go back to something you said earlier, Evelyn, which actually we were both about to say the same thing. I think that in terms of being readiness, but also in terms of autonomy.
Yeah.
I think that the more we try to push something for someone who isn't inviting us in to learn, the more they're going to get into that teen in them, or their toddler and their teen, asserting their autonomy and pushing it off. So I think that we do have to find a way to help people be open before we try to give them too much. So autonomy is really one of the psychological underpinnings of intuitive eating. Is diet culture crosses that boundary of that place inside of you that knows what's right for you. And so it's the same thing with trying to if we're trying to push intuitive eating on someone who isn't ready for it, isn't motivated for it, they're going to push back at it. So I think I said that before. Anyway, I just wanted to pick up on that piece of it.
Those are
that was good.
Yeah, really, really excellent points. I love that. And the concept of autonomy, and I love the way you explain that, of how like that's where diet culture just really crosses the line, is it makes you believe that you can't be trusted and you need to give that autonomy over, hand that over to someone else. And that's the beauty of the process of intuitive eating, is reclaiming that trust and that sense of I am wise and I can figure this out and I can fall down, but I can get back up. And everything you both have said so far has just been so wise and brilliant. Such good points.
Diet culture tells you what you should do, and whenever you hear about should, this is what you should eat, this is what you shouldn't eat, this is, how much you should exercise. When that should's in there, it's going to ultimately trigger people to rebel. I often say to my clients who say to me, I'm just such a failure at dieting, I'll say to them, no, actually, you're a success at ego development, because you're not just going to do what you're told that you should do. So they feel a lot better when they hear that.
Yeah, I just thought of another point that's been helpful for me in those social interactions. And I actually use this when I'm with my clients too, and it might sound a little bit awkward explaining it, but it really does work better than it sounds as you talk about it. As you're engaged, if you decide someone's reachable, teachable, and ready, and you also have the bandwidth, I love that, Evelyn. You can start off by just, asking some questions and just kind of listening more than you're talking. And if there feels like there's an open door to kind of explain some of what you're learning or what's resonating or working for you, I actually think it works really well to ask for permission. And it can kind of go something like this, like, oh, that's super interesting, and I've definitely thought that way too. Would it be okay with you if I like told you a little bit about kind of where I am with that, or what I've learned over the last few months? And asking that permission, if they say, oh, I don't really want to talk about it, or I'm not in the mood, or if they change the subject, then you can just know, okay, they weren't reachable, teachable, and ready. But sometimes they'll say, oh yeah, like I'm super interested in learning that, or I want to hear what your perspective is. And those conversations of sort of explaining this paradigm shift can go a lot better when there's buy-in from the other person, when you're not feeling like you're preaching at them or you're trying to convert them, to use some of the language that we've used so far in this episode. Do you both find that asking permission is an important piece?
All the time. Yeah. I'll often say, so are you open to my teaching you a little bit about the science behind that? Is that something you'd like to know about? And when they say yes, they're basically opening the door and inviting you in. And it's really all about this piece of autonomy. You're not pushing something on them, and you're asking permission. And when you are invited in, then they're going to hear you more. So Paige, that's perfect. Exactly what you're saying. It's just perfect.
Yeah, and I think it's also about, who is it that you are in conversation with. And I find all that you're describing, I completely agree with. And at the same time, when I'm on a platform and I'm speaking, I also take that opportunity to talk about, what, there is another way. And I'm going to invite you to look into all this research that we're going to be describing, and it might hit you wrong. It might be the first time that you've heard it, but I also like to normalize it, that this is the experience that most people go through. Elyse and I remember when we were first developing this process, and it was in big part because it wasn't feeling good working in the traditional way with people, because they weren't feeling, they'd come back in and blaming themselves on how this thing that these dietitians made, we were in private practice separately, that they failed it, and it's like, oh my God, this is causing harm. But Elyse and I were in a place of dissonance for quite some time, so that's normal. I think, and that helped.
So Evelyn, I want to say something. When people come to one of your lectures, they're inviting you in. They're going.
That's a good point,
huh? Hear what you have to say. Yeah. So
that's a great point.
I think you can. You can say anything you want to because they don't have to be there, and they came in. I think there's a difference in when we're counseling clients and when we're talking to
Yeah.
friends.
Yeah.
So there
Yeah.
you have that. That's what I was
Thank
thinking.
you. Thank
I
you. There
love
was
it.
an exception, by the way. There was a whole, I forget what university I went to, but all of the sorority members were required to go to my talk.
Oh,
And I
Yeah.
took it as an
Well,
opportunity,
see,
but yeah.
not at their
Yeah.
own free
But that's
will.
why
but see, they didn't invite you in. They just wanted to get, whatever credit that they were going to get
Yeah,
for going.
but you know what?
Yep.
That's when I tried to appeal to humanity, and talk about how this popular thing of trying to shrink your body, I find when I start talking about cases and experiences, not labeling it at them or directing it at them, they really relate. So there's all different kinds of ways. And I think in the beginning, I thought I had to convert everybody, to be honest, when I was, young and just, and now I realize that I've been humbled, that people do need to be ready. And sometimes we plant those seeds with that research, or sometimes just describing, we have another way. We have another way that actually feels good, that empowers you. And there's some research behind it. And if and when you're ever ready, my door is open to have a discussion about this, and it thrills me when that door does get open. So.
Yeah, and we as clinicians go through a parallel process, right? Where we do maybe start off a bit more rigid, like this is it, and I know the truth, and then we realize, wait, I need to be I am being humbled, and
Uh-huh.
I just feel like so much of that has such similar themes with what we're doing with our clients and patients, is trying to help them get a little bit more comfortable with uncertainty and getting a little bit more skillful at feeling unpleasant feelings. And we have them too, as we're doing our work, as we're talking about this paradigm shift, as we're explaining the science and dealing with pushback, whatever it might be. And that's what I love about food and talking about it and working on our relationship with it, is it's such a microcosm for so many bigger things. And I just find that incredibly meaningful, because if my job as a dietitian was just talking about carbohydrate, fat, and protein all day, I don't think I could do it. I just couldn't.
Well, definitely, Paige. I mean, I have known personally some dietitians who are ready to just leave the field. And
Yeah.
then when they discovered what an amazing experience it was to be able to help people tune into themselves and learn about intuitive eating, their whole practice has changed. Um, and they have a wonderful career now where they were about to give the whole thing up. So important.
It's incredible, because it's so gratifying. And so they become the facilitator and the witness of this kind of life-changing process. And in that process, they change too, which I love. It's beautiful. And what you were saying, Paige, I absolutely agree. That our relationship with food, mind, and body mirrors relational issues that go on in life. And sometimes, someone will say something to me like something very binary, like, oh my God, I really suck at this. They're talking maybe at this time about intuitive eating or whatever it is they work on. And I'll say, I'm curious if you have that theme in other areas in your life. And like, how do you know? Because
Yeah.
it's a mirror, and I think that's what's so profoundly deep and also gratifying, that as you change your relationship with food, it ends up impacting other areas in your life, which is why it does become life-changing,
Yes. So
Intuitive
beautiful.
living, as I said before, it really does extend to
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
Such a beautiful thing. All right. I want to ask you this question because I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on it. So, there's a lot of people who will share how difficult it is to connect to what's happening in their body due to experiencing trauma. And I would love to
Mhm.
know, what would you tell someone who says it just feels really inaccessible, or it feels almost maybe even unsafe to connect to my body, my sense of hunger and fullness? And obviously, intuitive eating is so much more expansive than that. But just to be fair, that's sometimes how people think of it, especially early on. Um, so tell me, what would you say to someone who struggles with that interoceptive awareness due to their trauma history?
Well, I think we have to
Yeah.
really affirm it, and that in order to be present, you need to feel safe. And I can't tell you, Paige, the amount of conversations I've had around this, and that level of safety can be cultivated. And that's when we look, are they currently in therapy and all these kinds of
Right.
things. And it doesn't mean that you're broken, but what it means is we need to look at our expectations. And maybe right now you can't access that, and that's okay. We can still do nourishment as self-care. And there's ways to work with this. So part of what I do is I normalize the trauma effect. Your body is trying to protect yourself. And, through a good, and this is where it's really important to be working with a really good trauma therapist and being in communication with them. But there are ways through this. And it's one of the things Elyse and I were clear about, or tried to be in the book, that if you're, experiencing something like trauma or like an eating disorder, or you've got a medical condition, it's going to be important to work with the specialist in that area who's also trained with in intuitive eating, because there's a skillful way to go through this. So what would you add to that, Elyse?
Well, I think it's so important for us to understand and for the client to understand that um, coping with trauma often means going out of body, not being attached to to what's going on in their bodies. The way they get through the trauma is to, go somewhere else. And so to help them understand that this is why they're having such difficulty, and it's part of their coping mechanism to not be in tune with their interoceptive awareness is not something, as you said, Evelyn, that it's safe for them to go there. And so the first thing I was going to say when you asked the question, Paige, was that I think that the person who has experienced so much trauma really does need to do some work with a trauma therapist, a really good one, someone especially who understands intuitive eating, perhaps before they can actually do this work with us. So, and of course, it depends on the extent of the trauma. So we have to be very sensitive to that and help them understand and not feel bad about themselves that they're not being able to tune in, to hunger and fullness. So that was
I
my
would
thought.
also add, and I'd be interested in your thoughts here, but I noticed that many people sort of pedestalize hunger and fullness as the goal,
yes.
right? Like we want to, that's the most important thing. Yeah. Reject diet culture, blah, blah, blah. But like, let's really do this hunger and fullness thing. And so when I get that question, I really like to just share, like, there's so many other things. And like, and I even try to normalize, like, even when you are really far into this process and feel really confident in your ability to connect to those cues, I just, like me, as I'll just share, like, I don't always feel super in tune with hunger and fullness. Sometimes it's like eating is kind of guesswork, and sometimes you just kind of move on and say, oh, I think that's probably it, and I have stuff to do, I have things to get done. And so we don't want this to become this laborious, like, I have to think about this every second of every day. And there's priorities that you can kind of establish based on what's happening for you in your own body, that you can say, okay, seems like the biggest priority right now is to really start to just build awareness around what does diet culture even look like? How does it show up in my life? And it's tempting to say, oh, I'm not really quote unquote doing intuitive eating if I'm not doing it all. But then you have to kind of look at, there's some perfectionism there, there's some all or nothing thinking, there's some pass fail, and we really want to keep all the concepts sort of on equal playing field with each other.
So Paige, this is one of my favorite topics, actually, that you just brought up. In my work and in Evelyn's work also, I know we are actually shifting a focus to satisfaction rather than hunger and fullness. For my clients, I don't even touch hunger for a while, because I think that when they can embrace the idea of looking for the way that they can get the most satisfaction out of their eating, it actually brings them to a place where they're able to understand that eating when they're moderately hungry versus, in primal hunger or not hungry at all, brings them more satisfaction. And it takes that pressure off of them to be worrying about, am I eating at the right hunger level? or stopping at the right fullness level. And it's a real shift, and it's been very satisfying, to use the word, for my clients to say, oh, you mean I don't have to worry about that so much? So I wanted to bring that up. Yes.
Beautiful point. What about you, Evelyn?
No, I completely agree. And one of the things Elyse and I like to stress, when you write a book, of course, there's an order, the 10 principles, 1 through 10. But when you are either as a reader reading the book or a practitioner facilitating the work, you don't have to go in order. And many, many, many times, as Elyse was suggesting, my jumping off point is satisfaction. And part of the reason is, as you know, in our culture, diet culture, eating has been so pathologized, the body's been pathologized. And if we start with this idea of, well, what does satisfaction feel like to you? It's such a curious question, and it's not punitive, and it's so incredibly personal. I don't know what's satisfying for you. And so then we get into the nuances of what would be like a satisfying meal, and all these kinds of things, without even getting in to the hunger fullness aspect. And even when we're working on making peace with food, all different kinds of food is looking at that, is what would be a satisfying food experience, even when you're working with some of these forbidden foods and so on. So it's really nuanced, and at the same time, it's really exciting, and it's very personal. Only you can answer that question. And so what that does, it really gives you more personal authority, personal autonomy, and you're grounded in your own authentic truth. And by the time you work through this process, that's what really starts to happen, that the winds of diet culture can be blowing very, very strong, but you're deeply rooted in your authentic truth of your body, of your connection, and how things feel. And then what another person says is really irrelevant, because you truly, truly know they don't have the direct experience of your body, only you do. And that's something really valid and very sacred,
So from
Evelyn,
a practical standpoint, I'm sorry, Paige, go ahead.
No, you're good. Go ahead, Elyse.
Okay, I was going to say, from a practical standpoint, we actually pushed up the satisfaction chapter in front of fullness in the new book. And in my teen book, and I'm writing a journal book right now, I've got satisfaction as the second chapter. So it's moving around.
and that's okay.
Yeah,
I love the idea of satisfaction as a jumping off point. And Evelyn, your description of that as being curious and not punitive is the complete polar opposite of dieting, right? It's not curious at all, and it's completely punitive. So I love that. That really resonates a lot. Okay, what about this really common question of, this resonates, this makes sense, I feel it in my bones, I love it, I agree with it, but it's so hard for me because I'm so worried that if I really do connect to my body and honor it and learn this work, I'm worried, what will that look like in terms of weight? Like, in other words, a fear of gaining weight in the process of intuitive eating. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll jump in. Okay. I do a lot of work around radical acceptance and helping people make peace with the fact that their bodies are going to be what they're meant to be, size, shape, weight, whatever it is, and helping them come to that place of understanding that the more they try to, create a different size or shape or weight, they're just going to be more focused on what's wrong with them rather than accepting what's beautiful and wonderful about themselves. And I have compassion, and I help them feel compassion for the fact that they're scared that their bodies might change and they won't be what they like. But also, as they start to accept that, we're kind of DNA programmed for all of these things. And it takes a lot of pressure off of them, actually, which when they understand that they can't necessarily predict or decide or fix anything, in that way about their bodies. And so it brings them more to a place of starting to appreciate all the aspects of themselves and the things that they can do right now in their, in their here and now bodies. And while at the same time helping them understand that diet culture has been what has pushed them to believe that they're not going to be okay with themselves if they do gain weight. And it's a difficult conversation, and people want to get some comfort, and the comfort, I think, comes from that radical acceptance. Not easy, though.
No, it's not. And what I find, it's also setting up the expectation that these are going to be many conversations, that just talking about this perspective, and it's really beautiful, Elyse, what you said, it's not going to change somebody who's been conditioned in our diet culture that really reinforces fat phobia and weight stigma. And sometimes what I like to do is to even take a look and start exploring, well, what were bodies treated like in your family? Did people gossip about other people's bodies in your family? What messages did you get about a body from your father, from your mother? Then looking at the siblings and so on, and really drawing this out, aunts and uncles, and then looking at life's events. And I do that for perspective taking. It's not that they're suddenly going to go, oh, thank you, I've now completely changed my mind, but it's giving them some context as to why this is so deep, and why just changing your thought that one day isn't going to change it, because we're dealing with uprooting a belief system that was really internalized at a very young age. And I would say it's even intergenerational. And I find with that, it gives them a little more space to start exploring this. And as Elyse was saying earlier, being really careful that this doesn't come across as shaming for this desire that they want to change the body because of the diet culture thing that we're living in. And is it possible that we can hold that desire, we acknowledge that it's there because of all of this conditioning and all the suppression of the different things that are going on, and we can still work actively toward intuitive eating, and we can talk as much as you need to and process what's going on about your relationship with your body. And I think where this gets really actually challenging and difficult is for people who are in marginalized bodies. When you are in a large body, I've had this conversation with some fat activists, and they'll say, it's one thing when someone has thin privilege, they're in a straight-sized body, and they make peace with food, they make peace with their body, and it's kumbaya, and they ride off into the sunset, if you will. Somebody in a large body makes peace with their eating, makes peace with their body, but they go out into a hostile culture in which they get trolled and they get teased. They don't know if they're going to fit on airplane seats and so on. And so sometimes we have to look at what people are doing is they're trying to conform to the social norm for their own safety, which is why we need to start looking at changing the culture and changing the systems of oppression that allow this to go on. And I find sometimes with that acknowledgement, it allows some ease in there. And one of the things I also do, if somebody's in a larger body, let's find where you can get some support. I also like to acknowledge my own thin privilege. I don't have your experience. Let's find some groups for you that you can really relate to, where people have had the lived experience and so on. So it can be quite complex.
Such great points
there.
I
agree with everything you're saying, Evelyn. And I think the acknowledgement is so important. And also helping people understand that we're not born with our belief systems. They have to be put into us. And so, yes, the way you think right now, it's that's not innate to you. Not thinking isn't. Your instincts are innate, but not that thinking. It's put into you. And I agree with you, Evelyn. Just helping them look at where are all these places that you've learned what you've learned, and of course you end up having the same. You have a reaction to that, but that acknowledgement is key. And the statement, as you just made, Evelyn, about thin privilege, we can never say that we know how somebody feels if we don't have the same, challenges that person has in any way.
Yeah, such great points. And I love the idea that this is an ongoing conversation. You don't need to feel like you're a failure if weight loss thoughts come into your mind. And of course they do. And this topic is not, at least in my office, sometimes people who have done some research either online or reading books or whatever it might be will come in and almost be scared to like talk about weight as if it's like the W word and it's a taboo topic. And I love what you're saying, that it's of course we'll talk about it. I want you to feel like there's a place that's that's safe to discuss what's happening and to explore it. But and what we're not saying is that you need to completely get rid of these thoughts. In fact, having that expectation that you're not allowed to think that, or if it comes up, then you're doing something wrong, just can make it so that you're more likely to just sort of say, well, this isn't for me, or I guess I'm failing at this. It's more of a practice and more of a curiosity of like, if that thought guides me, does it take me where I want to go? Does it help me live in alignment with my values and to feel full and fulfilled? And most people who at least I work with have long histories where they can look and say, oh, no, that doesn't take me where I want to go. And I expect to have that conversation over and over and over again with people.
Yeah.
So I love that point. Okay, well, I think we're wrapping up. I would love to hear, where do you think intuitive eating is headed? You talked about that a little bit in the beginning. I would love to hear kind of what do you see as the next things that you'd love to see ideally in a perfect world, culturally or individually or research-wise. I'd just love to hear any kind of closing thoughts about the whole phenomenon that you two are responsible for. And I mean that in the best way.
I think
And I
with,
okay,
go ahead.
No, I'll say one thing and then Evelyn, you can jump in. In an ideal world, there would be no oppression. There would be, everyone would have dignity regardless of, any of the things that they're now judged by. So go ahead, Evelyn. that would be the ideal world.
Yeah, and related to what you're saying, Elyse, getting even deeper, and this is where I see the future happening, is looking at what do we need to do to start changing the system. So when we came up with intuitive eating, this is directed at the individual. But a lot of what's happening right now, there are systemic problems of oppression that are creating these problems. And so we need to be looking at how can we bridge this with social justice issues. And this is something I'm getting more education and learning about, and that's something I'm challenging other health professionals that I train, is looking at that and looking at what we can be doing to be better human beings and citizens in terms of anti-racism work, looking at an internal level, community level, and then at a systems level. And I'm working with social justice business coach right now on these issues, and it's really it's mind-boggling to me. To not be so clear seeing, to know exactly what that's going to look like, but to know that's the direction, at least where I'm going, and then making this accessible to people in marginalized bodies from marginalized communities and so on. So, one of the things, we haven't announced this, but, Elyse and I are offering scholarships for marginalized health professionals from marginalized communities to do this work, to become trained and certified so that they can go into their communities and help people. So I see I'm just at the beginning phase of this right now. I'm being transparent in this. I'm not an expert in social justice. I never got trained in it. I'm getting education and training now, but that's where I'm headed. So, and I see intuitive eating headed in that direction. What do you think, Elyse?
Yeah, and Evelyn, I think what's so important about what you're saying and what I'm feeling is that as long as we keep our minds open and keep learning and getting educated as best we can, then we can be part of that change. And I'm so frustrated with, there's people in my own life who are, in my own family, who are just not open-minded, who are just kind of, why is everybody talking about this stuff? And that frustrates me so much. So I'm not judging myself for not knowing enough. I'm just regularly trying to learn and do better. So,
yeah, and related to that, I saw this thing that just got me, and oh my God, I'm trying to remember who it was from. It was Brandon is his first name. I don't remember his last name, so I'm sorry to Brandon. And it's about this idea of having the privilege of ignorance, and that is sometimes when people have privilege, they don't need to know these things, And so I just thought, oh, that's interesting. So it's a learning process. We're unpeeling the onion and ultimately looking at, it's not enough just to learn, but what meaningful action can we take? How can we be impactful in dismantling these systems of oppression, which frees all of us, which frees us from diet culture as well. So that's what I'm seeing.
Beautiful.
And one last thing, one last thing is just coming off of that, Evelyn, in terms of privilege. and this is something that I think is so important. Intuitive eating is a privilege, meaning that not everyone is going to be able to become an intuitive eater if they have food insecurity, if they don't have access to food, if our systems are not helping them get what they need. So I just wanted to throw that in as a little last piece of this.
Well, yeah, and then even fine tune that, I would still say they can become an intuitive eater, but what it looks like might be different. How you define satisfaction might be different. And when you look at some of this emerging research coming out on food insecurity and binge eating and food insecurity and eating disorders, I look at it as a natural compensatory response of food deprivation, So I think there's ways of working with this, but I think we also need a lot more research and a lot more people with lived experience in this way to help lead this path. So I think there's hope down the road.
Thank you for that hope. I'll take it wherever I can get it these days. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today. What a privilege and honor, speaking of privilege, to sit down and talk with these two humans who have been so influential in my professional life. And I'm just so grateful that my job has led me down this funny path of being able to be on a call with both of you. I have to say that's kind of amazing. And I just really love it. I'm so grateful for that. So thank you so much for joining me.
You're so welcome. Thank you for the opportunity. So appreciated.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.